Hello and welcome to this Literature Revision Systems lesson on Seamus Heaney's follower for the AQA GCSE Literature course, and this is for Paper 2, Section B, the poetry question, and are focusing on the love and relationships poetry cluster, because remember there are two options, power and conflict or love and relationships. If you've seen the previous lessons, you'll know that I divide the 15 poems into two subcategories. And that's because in previous year's papers and in all the sample papers, the question is always invariably focused on either romantic love or family relationships. And so the theory behind this process is that as long as we can write about the printed poem and link that to another poem on either of those themes, romantic love or familial love, we'll be able to attain very top grades. So we begin our focus for romantic love with Sonnet 29 and with family relationships with Mother Any Distance, and then we'll learn how to link that with increasing complexity to each of the other poems so that we're able to answer any potential question the exam board will post. So Mother Any Distance, if you saw the last lesson, you'll notice that I suggested this year, 2023, the question would be family relationships, and indeed it was. The printed poems before you were mine. So next year it's going to be difficult to call, but in future lessons I'll post what I think is most probable and what you should focus your revision on if you need to cut corners due to lack of time. But today we're looking at follower, and we're going to focus on a three-part analysis of that poem. So the context for the poem, it conveys a respect for skilled physical labour, and that reflects Heaney's rural upbringing amongst an agricultural community. It's from his book, The Death of a Naturalist, and that focuses on the theme of nature. And this poem describes the changing relationship with his father as a response to that, as a natural cycle of life. It's autobiographical, focuses on childhood memories, like much of Heaney's work, although it has been suggested that perhaps Heaney's father wasn't actually a ploughman, although he did work in farming, and that therefore this is some certain amount of poetic license being exercised here. So to the poem. My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders glowed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. So to summarise the content simply, he describes his father's skills as a ploughman on the farm. He remembers how he clumsily followed his father around and would sometimes ride on his back as he worked. He reveals that he aspired to be a ploughman like his father when he was a boy. At the end, the roles are reversed and his father follows him. Okay, as always, we're going to go through a three-part analysis. Now, there's so much you could write about these poems. You could write, a book about them. But we only have 45 minutes to write about two poems, and that's an exam where you're going to be overwhelmed with the amount of demands made on you cognitively. And so we're going to really zero in on the bare minimum, but really try to develop and explore that in as much detail as necessary to attain a top grade. That's a grade 9. So initially we're going to focus on the opening of the poem, then we move on to a point in the middle, and then we look at the end of the poem. And that's the same pattern for each of these analyses. So I'll colour code the quotations I'd like you to focus on. Yellow for paragraph 1, blue for paragraph 2, green for paragraph 3. You can see I've got a point here on this slide which we'll refer back to for paragraph 3, mapping the furrow exactly. But we'll begin with line 2, his shoulders glowed like a full sail strung, the simile there. Excuse me. So that presents an image of his father's Herculean strength. It's an image of like the ancient god Atlas carrying the world on his back. And it suggests how the child idolises his father, gives a sense of a child's sense of wonder at the power and the skill of adults. And it builds up this kind of mythological kind of context or subtext of the poem or tone of the poem. There's also a link between ploughing and sailing, and that again builds this heroic tone. It could be a reference to the Odyssean myth of travel across the sea, or it could simply be linking his sense of his father's skill mastering the land to that of a ship mastering the sea. So those are the points for our first paragraph. If you'd like to highlight and make some notes using my annotations, you may want to pause before we move on ourselves to point 2 now. So here I'm focusing on that first line from the beginning of the 4th verse, I stumbled in his hobnailed wake. And there I'm going to focus on this verb stumbled, which is, it describes, literally the boy's clumsy struggle to keep up with his father. But it also, in the context of this poem, in the argument we're going to develop now, I think it symbolises his feelings of inadequacy in comparison to his father. So what else makes me think that? Well, we've got the repetition of the pronoun I at the start of each verse, and that could emphasise some sense of separation, of isolation from his father. He can't reach his father, he can't keep up with him, he's not the same as him, despite his admiration. And also the list of verbs there at the beginning of verse 4, tripping, falling, yapping, they all emphasise weakness, don't they? A foolishness almost with the word yapping, which is quite it has quite negative connotations in regards to language, and that's an important point we'll develop in a moment. But those verbs simply, they contrast the father's power that's been established in the initial verses of the poem, and therefore they reinforce a sense of inferiority. And this is aided by breaking the rhythm. The poem has got a very clear and defined rhythm. It's called iambic tetrameter, and that means there are 8 syllables in each line. An unstressed and then a stressed syllable, and that actually was a rhythm used classically in ancient Greek and Roman poetry. So again, it references this mythological context of the poem, but that breaks here in this last verse to suggest that he just cannot be the same as his father. So those are the points essentially for our paragraph, to our middle paragraph. And we're going to move on now to our final paragraph. And we're looking at the long last sentence of the poem. And there's quite a lot in this. And this is, if you're familiar with the structure of the essay I'm teaching you, this is the point you'll start to learn, you'll initially start to learn, because this is what you'll initially compare to the end of Mothering Distance. So, this is a famous poem, and it's often suggested that this references the childhood stumbling to that of the stumbling of an old and infirm, decrepit old man. Many people suggest this is Heaney expressing his frustration of having to look after his elderly father, and the challenge seeming overwhelming and never ending. Notice the poem is open-ended. There's no full stop at the end, so as if this will continue to be a burden to him. However, I think if we're thinking about those nuances and the suggestions that Heaney feels inferior to his father, and that's been established all through the poem, I think we can also explore an alternative interpretation here, and by doing so, certainly we'll be hitting the criteria for the top level of the mark scheme. So I think this might also reference the poet's lingering insecurities. I know we've talked about how, yapping is quite a critical word for language, and as Heaney's work is with language, it suggests that he feels working with language perhaps is inferior to the pragmatic skill of his father working as a ploughman. So he feels if it's his work, his job, his trade is not as important perhaps. So he perhaps feels he can never get away from that idea that his father's broad shadow, he can't escape that feeling of inferiority, and even though he tries. And there's the link between ploughing and poetry. So as if it's Heaney, in writing this poem, is trying to overcome this sense of inferiority, because there's a link between ploughing and poetry in the Latin root of the word verse. That is versus, and that means the turn of a plough, and that's because perhaps ancient Romans noticed that the neat lines of a verse that were written resembled the neat lines of a well-ploughed field, and so that's why there was that etymological link between the two, verse and verses. So it suggests that this evenly structured poem, the quatrains, the iambic tetrameter, etc., are Heaney's attempt to match his father's skill, but we have this quite disconsolate tone to that last line, that the feeling of inferiority will not go away today. That the link of the rhyme as well suggests that will continue. That it will never be good enough, that it will never leave his father's shadow. Okay, so that will offer you quite a powerful and detailed paragraph exploring two very distinct interpretations of the poem, which will be a great way to finish the essay. So, how does the essay build? So, as always, we're going to follow this PETAL structure, which is very commonly used, isn't it? Well, we'll point out the context of the quotation that we're going to use, then we'll use terminology in our analysis, develop that, and link it to another quotation or idea. So, the notes I've given you can then, as I see these are the notes on point 1, as I remind you, we can convert this into a paragraph of analysis, such as this. The poem describes how Heaney as a boy idolised his father's Herculean strength, following him as he ploughed fields, his shoulders glowed like a full sail strung. This simile evokes an image of the Greek god Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders, and the nautical image of sail that extends through the poem adds to this heroic tone. That conveys the boy's love for and admiration of his father. He is almost mythologizing his father's skill and power. So that takes so many of the ideas that I shared with you in the annotations and converts them into a paragraph of analysis that would be more than adequate for top grades in the mark scheme. Now, following that PETAL process, if I annotate that, you can see that I've put the quotation or the evidence in red. The subject terminology is in dark blue. We've got the analysis in purple, and then the link to a further idea in blue at the end. So each of these paragraphs that I'm sharing with you follows this PETAL structure and ensures that we are going to be hitting the requirements of the mark scheme, therefore. So to help you learn this, or with my students, very often what I use is a chart process, breaking that paragraph down step by step so that it can be easily learnt, rather than being overwhelmed by a full paragraph. You can take it one step at a time. So this was the basic chart process. And I have some resources available on the link below. And there we see that paragraph broken down into those different steps so that they can be easily managed and learned. So if we look at point 2, that could become a paragraph broken down like this. Despite the boy's desperate desire to be like his father, it seems he feels he will never be good enough. As he admits, I stumbled in his hobnailed wake. This metaphor suggests his feelings of inadequacy. The verbs he uses to describe himself, tripping, falling, yapping, also contrast the powerful, confident actions of his father to reinforce this sense of his own deficiencies. Perhaps yapping indicates a feeling that Heaney's work as a writer might be trivial in comparison to the masculine and practical work of his father. The tight iambic tetrameter reflects a sense of his admiration for and attempt to match his father's skill, but this breaks down in the last verse to suggest Heaney's feelings that he will never quite equal his father exactly. Beginning each of these verses with the pronoun I conveys this feeling of isolation from his father. And then finally, our last key paragraph could look like this. At the end, he describes what seems to be a role reversal, as now his elderly father follows him. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling and will not go away. Many people suggest this is a metaphor expressing frustration as Heaney feels the burden of looking after his old and infirm father, linking his own childhood stumbling to that of a decrepit old man. However, this may be suggesting his own nagging doubts that he'll never escape his father's broad shadow. Perhaps he feels that as a poet he'll never live up to his dad because the yapping of words writing poetry will never be mapping the furrow exactly. The link between ploughing and poetry and the Latin root of the word verse, versus meaning a turn of the plough, suggests that this evenly structured poem is Heaney's attempt to match his father's skill, an attempt that he may feel will never be good enough, that he'll never leave his shadow. Okay, so in total that's the key analysis on this poem. Now, I suggest that you begin by focusing on that last line. Make sure you're fully conversant or confident in being able to produce a detailed analysis of mother-any distance, and that would be the backbone, the basis then for an essay on, if you're asked to compare family poems, that will be the basis, and then you'll be able to link that in to each of the other poems. And I'll show you the structure in a second, but we need to begin with a comparative introduction. So I'd suggest this could be the basic model of a comparison between mother-any distance and follower, where we use the same structure, always both, however, whereas. So both mother-any distance and follower describe a parent-child relationship that changes as the child grows up. However, Armitage focuses on the son's feelings as a young adult leaving home for the first time, whereas Heaney describes a reversal in the roles of father and son as they grow older. So we point out a similarity and then we explain the key differences. So that will instantly start to pick up marks as one of the criteria is that you make a comparative response. So the different structures. Now, I suggested this would be a basis for a grade 7 essay, but actually, in my experience, students have attained grade 9 using this structure. So it might save you some work or some learning. So we begin with the comparative introduction, then we go through mother-any distance, that key poem, 3 full paragraphs on that, from the beginning, the middle and the end. And then at the end of that analysis of the last point of mother-any distance, we will then link that to the ending of follower. But today it's my father who keeps stumbling and won't go away. And that is all essentially you would need. You may not feel confident if you want to be more thorough and you have more energy and time and enthusiasm, then you may wish to provide a more detailed essay. So as always, I suggest that this could be an incremental kind of an increase in complexity and therefore an increase in marks. So this would be the grade 8 where we begin with the comparison. We have the beginning of mother-any distance linked to the beginning of follower, and then we continue with mother-any distance and then finish off, as in the previous structure, with the analysis of follower. And then for grade 9, this is a thoroughly integrated response. But as I said, in my experience, I think this isn't necessary to get the grade 9. Although if you want to be certain of top marks, 30 to 30 for this component, then perhaps you'd want to focus on that and be as thorough as that. Well, good luck with your studies. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, give it a like, and I will endeavour to complete lessons on the remaining poems over the next months. Thank you.